The screen flickers with the grainy, high-contrast texture of 1970 San Francisco, a city drowning in a tide of neon lights and rising crime rates. We hear the rhythmic, heavy thud of leather boots on asphalt, a sound that carries the weight of authority and impending violence. A man in a tweed jacket stands defiant against a backdrop of urban decay, holding a piece of steel that looks far too large for a human hand. He stares down the barrel of a blued steel monster, its deep, dark finish shimmering with a somber, almost midnight blue luster, rather than the garish flash of chrome. His eyes narrow, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that would soon echo through the halls of cinematic history. The weapon is a Smith Wesson Model 29, and in the shadows of the city, its polished, blued surface looks like a predatory shadow come to life. "I know what you're thinking," he says, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a blade. Did he fire 6 shots or only 5? In that singular moment, the world didn't just meet Inspector Dirty Harry Callahan. It met the weapon that would redefine the archetype of the American lawman for the next half-century. The Smith & Wesson Model 29, chambered in the monstrous .44 Magnum, was thrust into the spotlight, shimmering under the California sun like a religious icon of cold, dark iron. This wasn't just a sidearm. It was a character in its own right, a handheld cannon capable of blowing a man's head clean off. The audience watched in awe as the massive cylinder rotated, the hammer clicked back with a mechanical finality, and the muzzle blast lit up the silver screen like a supernova. Before 1971, the average movie cop carried a modest .38 special, a reliable but uninspiring tool of the trade that blended into the uniform, or perhaps a .357 Magnum, if they were particularly well-equipped. While the .357 had already begun to pave the way for more powerful law enforcement sidearms, the jump to the .44 was a seismic shift. Suddenly, the previous standards weren't enough. The public demanded power, they demanded spectacle, and they demanded what Harry called the most powerful handgun in the world. Technically, by 1971, the .454 Casull already existed and surpassed the .44 Magnum in raw energy, but as a mass-produced, commercially available firearm, the Model 29 was the undisputed king of the retail shelf. The Hollywood cop gun stereotype was born in that flash of gunpowder, creating an indelible image of the lone wolf detective, carrying a weapon that defied logic and physics. It established a visual shorthand. The size of the gun was directly proportional to the grit and determination of the man wielding it. But as the shell casings hit the floor and the credits rolled, a massive disconnect began to grow between the flickering shadows of the theater and the harsh reality of the precinct. The image of the police officer as a high-caliber gunslinger was a seductive lie, crafted by directors who prioritized frame composition over ballistic data. In the real world, the Smith & Wesson Model 29 was an anomaly, a niche tool designed specifically for big-game hunters and silhouette shooters, men who needed to drop elk or hit steel targets at long range, not for the daily grind of urban patrol. Yet the myth was so potent that it began to bleed into reality, influencing public perception and even the procurement desires of actual law enforcement agencies. We see the slow-motion recoil of a .44 Magnum in a darkened range, the barrel snapping upward with a violence that threatens to dislocate a novice's wrist. This is the Magnum force illusion, the belief that more power always equals more effectiveness, regardless of the cost in control, weight, or capacity. For decades, the cinematic cop was defined by this aesthetic of overwhelming force, a trend that would eventually transition from the polished wood grips of revolvers to the cold, utilitarian steel of the Wonder Nines. Every action hero from the 70s through the 90s stood on the shoulders of that first massive Smith & Wesson, chasing the ghost of Dirty Harry. The roar of the .44 Magnum became the heartbeat of the action genre, setting a standard for muzzle flashes that looked like flamethrowers and impact forces that sent villains flying through plate glass windows. Physical laws were suspended in favor of cool factor, creating a generation of viewers who believed a handgun could stop a moving car. As we peel back the layers of this cinematic veneer, we find a fascinating intersection of marketing, ballistics, and cultural anxiety. The Hollywood cop gun wasn't just a prop. It was a response to a society that felt increasingly out of control, seeking a hero with a weapon big enough to solve any problem with a single pull of the trigger. But behind the smoke and the dramatic lighting, the truth of the blue steel era is far more complex, involving engineering trade-offs and ergonomic nightmares that no scriptwriter bothered to mention. The legend of the Model 29 was a masterpiece of accidental product placement that changed the firearms industry forever, even if it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what a police officer actually needs. In this exploration, we are just looking at the steel and the springs. We are looking at how a medium of fiction dictated the reality of the holster. We are diving into the gap between the deafening roar of the cinema speakers and the quiet, professional reality of the men and women who actually carry the weight of the badge. The stage is set, the hammer is cocked, and the myth is ready to be dissected. From the high recoil drama of the 70s revolvers to the high-capacity revolution of the 80s semi-automatics, this is the story of how Hollywood sold us a dream of firepower that the real world could never truly handle. Part 2. The Blue Steel Rain. S&W Model 29. In the early 1950s, the engineers at Smith & Wesson weren't trying to create a cultural icon or a tool for urban law enforcement. They were chasing a ghost, the ultimate hunting handgun. The legendary Elmer Keith, a man whose hat was as big as his ambitions, had spent years pushing the limits of the .44 special cartridge until the brass literally gave up. He wanted a round that could drop a charging grizzly or a massive elk at distances previously reserved for rifles. Smith & Wesson listened, and in 1955, they birthed a monster, the Model 29. Built on the massive N-frame, it was a masterpiece of polished blue steel and walnut, chambered in the brand new .44 Magnum. It was never intended for the leather duty belt of a city cop. It was a tool for the wilderness, meant for precision and extreme terminal ballistics. When it hit the market, it was a niche tool for the elite woodsman. It was expensive, heavy, and possessed a recoil that could sprain a wrist if the shooter wasn't paying attention. For nearly 15 years, it sat in the catalogs as a specialty item, often collecting dust in gun store display cases, because most people simply couldn't handle the bite of the Magnum. Then came 1971. A man named Harry Callahan stepped onto the streets of San Francisco with a 6.5-inch barrel and a sneer. When Clint Eastwood uttered those famous words about the most powerful handgun in the world, the Smith & Wesson factory was suddenly buried under a mountain of back orders they weren't prepared to fill. While ballistic experts knew the .454 Casull held the crown for raw power, the public didn't care. They wanted the gun that Dirty Harry used to hold the line against chaos. The Dirty Harry effect was so profound that it single-handedly shifted the public's perception of what a police officer should carry. Suddenly, every patrolman in America wanted to trade in their reliable .38 specials or their .357 Magnums for the hand cannon that could supposedly blow your head clean off. The reality of the Model 29, however, was far more complicated than the silver screen suggested. To understand the engineering, you have to look at the sheer physics of the .44 Magnum. A standard 240 grain bullet leaves the barrel at nearly 1,500 feet per second, generating over 1,000 foot-pounds of energy. In a cinematic world, that energy translates to bad guys flying through plate glass windows. In the real world, that energy is a two-way street. Newton's third law dictates that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And in the case of the Model 29, that reaction is a violent, vertical snap of the muzzle. For a professional law enforcement officer, follow-up shots are the difference between life and death. If you miss with your first shot using the .44 Magnum, the time it takes to bring those heavy sights back down to the target feels like an eternity. In a high-stress gunfight, a second is a lifetime. Furthermore, the Model 29 was a beast to carry. Weighing in at nearly 3 pounds when fully loaded, it was a literal anchor on a leather duty belt. Officers who tried to mimic Harry Callahan often found themselves suffering from chronic hip and back pain after an 8-hour shift of lugging that steel around. Then there was the issue of over-penetration. The .44 Magnum was designed to punch through the thick hide and heavy bone of a bear. In a crowded urban environment, that same bullet would go through a suspect, through the wall behind them, and potentially through the neighbor's refrigerator 3 houses down. Law enforcement agencies quickly realized that the most powerful handgun in the world was actually a liability in a city. It was too loud, too heavy, and far too dangerous for bystanders. The muzzle flash alone in a low-light situation was enough to temporarily blind the officer who fired it, leaving them vulnerable. Despite these practical nightmares, the Smith & Wesson Model 29 became the gold standard of the cinematic cop. It represented a specific era of American grit, the lone wolf who didn't care about red tape or departmental regulations. The gun wasn't just a weapon, it was a character in itself, anchored by its dark, blued finish that absorbed the neon lights of the city. The craftsmanship of the early Model 29s was undeniably superb. The S-prefix serial numbers are still hunted by collectors today for their 4-screw frames and pinned and recessed cylinders. These were guns built with a level of hand-fitting that the modern industry has largely abandoned in favor of mass production. Every time the hammer was cocked, the mechanical click was a symphony of precision-machined steel. The trigger pull in single action was crisp, like breaking a glass rod. It was an aristocrat's weapon, dressed in the uniform of a street sweeper, and Hollywood loved that contradiction. But as the 1970s bled into the 80s, the limitations of the 6-shot revolver began to show. Criminals were becoming better armed, and the Magnum force philosophy was meeting the cold, hard reality of magazine capacity. The era of the wheel gun was reaching its zenith, and a new challenger was waiting in the wings. The Model 29 taught the world that a gun could be a movie star. But it also proved that what works for a scripted hero rarely works for the person actually wearing the badge. It was a beautiful, terrifying anomaly, a hunting rifle disguised as a pistol that briefly convinced the world it belonged in a holster. As we transition from the smoke-filled streets of 70s cinema, we see the blue steel of Smith & Wesson begin to fade. The shiny polish and the heavy wood grips were about to be replaced by something colder, faster, and far more European. The Wonder 9 revolution was coming, and it would change the Hollywood cop gun forever. Part 3. The Plastic Revolution and the Wonder 9, Beretta 92 FS. The dawn of the 1980s didn't just bring neon lights and synthesizers. It brought a fundamental crisis of confidence to American law enforcement. On the sun-drenched streets of Miami and the gritty corners of Los Angeles, the traditional six-shot revolver was facing a mathematical nightmare. Criminal enterprises were now wielding high-capacity submachine guns and semi-automatic pistols, leaving officers outgunned and desperate for a tactical evolution. The era of the old guard and their heavy .357 Magnums, which had served as the high-power standard before the .44 Magnum craze, was ending, replaced by a demand for volume, speed, and reliability. This was the birth of the Wonder 9 era, a term coined to describe a new generation of 9mm semi-automatics that promised double the capacity of a revolver and half the recoil. While several manufacturers vied for the crown, one Italian masterpiece was destined to become the face of this transition, the Beretta 92 FS. The Beretta 92 FS was not just a tool. It was a mechanical sculpture of aluminum and steel that looked like the future. With its distinctive open slide design, it exposed the barrel in a way that felt aggressive yet sophisticated. It was a weapon that looked just as good in a high-end leather holster as it did under the flickering lights of a movie set. But the Beretta's rise to legendary status wasn't an overnight marketing fluke. It was forged in the fires of the most rigorous testing in military history. In 1985, the United States Department of Defense officially adopted the Beretta 92F as the M9, the primary sidearm for the U.S. Armed Forces. This decision sent shockwaves through the industry, signaling the final death knell for the venerable .45 ACP 1911. If the military stamp of approval provided the credibility, Hollywood provided the immortality. In 1987, a film titled Lethal Weapon introduced the world to Martin Riggs, a volatile detective who treated his Beretta 92F like an extension of his own soul. Audiences watched in awe as Riggs disassembled the weapon with lightning speed, showcasing its modularity and modern engineering. Suddenly, the Hollywood cop had a new silhouette. The Beretta wasn't just a gun, it was a character in itself, characterized by its 15-round magazine and its double-action trigger pull. For the first time, the cinematic cop didn't have to pause and reload every 6 seconds. He could stay in the fight, raining down 9mm rounds with a rhythmic precision that the old Smith Wesson revolvers could never match. Then came 1988, and with it, Die Hard. John McClane, trapped in Nakatomi Plaza, became the ultimate ambassador for the Beretta 92 FS. The weapon's reliability became a plot point, its sleek black finish contrasting against the grime and blood of a man pushed to his limits. The Beretta was no longer just a Wonder 9. It was the survivor's choice, the professional's insurance policy. Technically, the Beretta was a marvel of its time, featuring the falling locking block system that ensured smooth cycling and reduced the chances of a stovepipe jam. The open slide design wasn't just for aesthetics. It allowed for faster cooling of the barrel and provided a massive ejection port, making the weapon incredibly reliable even under heavy fire. For a police officer, this meant a weapon that wouldn't fail when the adrenaline was redlining. The transition from the Magnum force to the Wonder 9 also represented a shift in police philosophy. It was the move from one shot, one kill to suppressive fire and tactical volume. Real-world police departments began to see the logic. A 9mm round was easier to control, allowing for faster follow-up shots, and having 15 rounds in the grip meant fewer reloads during high-stress encounters. However, the Beretta 92 FS also introduced a new aesthetic to the screen. the Tactical Cool. It featured an ambidextrous safety, a decocker, and a reversible magazine release, features that looked incredibly busy and impressive in close-up shots. It was the gun that taught a generation of moviegoers what a magazine was, as opposed to a clip. Despite its Hollywood fame, the Beretta was a massive handgun. Its grip was notoriously thick, designed to house that double-stack 15-round magazine, making it a challenge for officers with smaller hands. Yet, in the world of 80s and 90s action cinema, its size only added to its presence. It filled the frame, its slide locking back with a satisfying metallic clack that signaled the end of a climatic gunfight. While the Smith Wesson Model 29 was a relic of the frontier brought into the city, the Beretta 92 FS was a piece of European precision, tailored for the global stage. It bridged the gap between the ruggedness of the past and the high-tech demands of the future. It was the gun that proved that modern didn't have to mean soulless. As the 90s progressed, the Beretta 92 FS became the most recognizable handgun on the planet. It was the standard by which all other Hollywood cop guns were measured. It captured the imagination of a public that was moving away from the lone wolf vigilante and toward the specialized, tactical professional. But even as the Beretta reigned supreme, a new challenger was emerging from the shadows of Austria. A weapon made not of steel and aluminum, but of polymers and perfection. The plastic revolution was about to take the Beretta's crown. But for one glorious decade, the 92 FS was the undisputed king of the silver screen and the precinct locker room alike. This was the era where the Wonder 9 changed the math of the gunfight. It wasn't about the size of the hole you made. It was about how many chances you had to make it. The Beretta 92 FS didn't just replace the revolver. It redefined what it meant to be a modern protector in an increasingly violent world. Part 4. The Cinematic Lies. Recoil, Capacity, and Muzzle Flash. We have all seen the shot. The hero stands in the middle of a rain-slicked street, feet planted, firing a .44 Magnum with one hand, as if he were pointing a finger. The gun barks. A massive plume of orange flame erupts from the barrel, and the villain is hurled backward through a plate glass window by the sheer force of the impact. It is a masterpiece of choreography, a symphony of tension and release that satisfies our primal urge for justice. But if you take that same scene and apply the cold, unyielding laws of Newtonian physics, the cinematic illusion shatters like the very glass the stuntman just flew through. In the reality of the firing range, the Smith & Wesson Model 29 is not a scalpel. It is a handheld earthquake. When a .44 Magnum round ignites, it generates pressures upwards of 35,000 psi, sending a heavy lead projectile down the throat of the barrel with violent intent. The equal and opposite reaction doesn't just kick, it punishes the shooter's wrist, snapping the muzzle toward the sky with a ferocity that makes a rapid second shot nearly impossible for the uninitiated. To fire this weapon effectively, an officer needs a death grip, a perfect stance, and a high pain threshold, none of which are conducive to a high-speed foot chase. Hollywood's greatest lie is the myth of knockback power. In the world of movies, getting hit by a high-caliber bullet is equivalent to being struck by a speeding freight train, physically throwing the body backward. In the real world, momentum is conserved. If a bullet had enough force to throw a 200-pound man through a window, the recoil would have to throw the shooter backward just as far. Kinetic energy is about penetration and cavitation, the way a bullet tears through tissue, not about physically pushing an object like a kinetic hammer. Then we must talk about the bottomless magazine syndrome, a phenomenon that peaked during the action-heavy 80s and 90s. We watch the protagonist sweep a room with his Beretta 92 FS, pulling the trigger 30, 40, maybe 50 times without ever reaching for a spare mag. The Beretta is a high-capacity Wonder 9, yes, but its standard flush-fit magazine holds exactly 15 rounds. In a high-stress shootout, those 15 rounds disappear in approximately 4 seconds of sustained fire. Yet movie cops seem to possess trans-dimensional magazines that only run dry when the script demands a dramatic pause.
The visual language of the muzzle flash is another area where the silver screen departs from tactical reality. Directors love a massive, star-shaped explosion at the end of the barrel because it looks heroic and powerful on 35mm film. To achieve this, prop masters use specialized quarter-load or half-load blanks that contain powders designed to burn slow and bright outside the barrel. In a real-world defensive encounter, a massive muzzle flash is actually a liability, especially in low-light environments where it momentarily blinds the officer and gives away their exact position to the suspect. Consider the dual-wielding trope, famously popularized by Hong Kong action cinema and adopted by every Hollywood blockbuster thereafter. Seeing a detective diving through the air while firing 2 Berettas simultaneously is the pinnacle of cool, but it is an absolute nightmare of ballistics. In reality, you cannot use your sights if you are holding 2 guns, and you certainly cannot manage the independent recoil of 2 separate platforms while in mid-air. It is the fastest way to turn a controlled, tactical situation into a chaotic spray of lead that hits everything except the intended target. The sound design of Hollywood firearms is perhaps the most subtle deception of all. Every time a character draws a gun in a movie, it makes a distinctive metallic clink-shink sound, as if the weapon is made of loose silverware. In truth, a well-maintained duty weapon like a Glock or a Beretta is a tight, precision-engineered machine. It doesn't rattle when you move it. Furthermore, the deafening roar of a .357 or a .44 Magnum in an enclosed space like a hallway or a car would cause immediate, permanent hearing damage and physical disorientation. Yet movie characters hold entire conversations immediately after a gunfight. We also have to address the magic silencer. Movies have taught us that a suppressor turns a thunderous gunshot into a tiny bird-like chirp that can't be heard from the next room. This is a dangerous fallacy. A suppressed 9mm pistol is still roughly as loud as a jackhammer or a car door slamming. The device simply masks the location of the shooter and protects their hearing. It doesn't make the shooter an invisible ghost. It just makes the violence slightly less ear-piercing for the person pulling the trigger. Finally, there is the issue of one-shot stops. The cinematic cop fires a single round into the suspect's shoulder, and the suspect immediately drops their weapon and falls to the ground, neutralized but alive. Ballistic reality is far more gruesome and unpredictable. Human beings are remarkably resilient, and unless the central nervous system is compromised, a suspect can often continue to fight for seconds or even minutes after taking a fatal hit. The Hollywood gun implies a level of surgical precision and instant compliance that real-world physics simply cannot guarantee. This disconnect between the screen and the street isn't just a matter of bad science. It's a deliberate choice to prioritize the myth over the machine. The director wants you to feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of the hero's choice, and the sheer power of the law. To do that, they must amplify the physics, stretch the magazines, and silence the deafening reality of the gunpowder. But for the men and women who actually wore the badge, these cinematic flourishes were a far cry from the heavy,
dirty and loud reality of carrying a weapon for a living. Part 5. The Officer's Burden. Reality on the Streets. The Hollywood spotlight fades the moment the director yells, "Cut." But for the patrol officer, the weight of the duty belt never truly goes away. While the cinema focuses on the flash of the muzzle and the dramatic impact of the bullet, the reality of law enforcement is measured in hours, ounces, and the grueling monotony of the everyday carry. In the movies, a detective pulls a gleaming Smith Wesson Model 29 from a shoulder holster as if it were weightless. But in the real world, physics is a cruel taskmaster. A fully loaded N-frame revolver weighs nearly 3 pounds, a massive anchor that tugs at the lower back and hips over a 12-hour shift. By the mid-1980s, the romanticism of the big-bore revolver began to collide with the anatomical reality of a diversifying police force. Officers with smaller hands found the massive grips of the Magnum revolvers impossible to manage, leading to poor accuracy and dangerous handling in high-stress situations. The Beretta 92FS offered a reprieve in terms of capacity, but it was a massive handgun in its own right, often described as a brick by those with shorter fingers. The transition from the wheel gun era to the Wonder 9 era wasn't just about firepower. It was a desperate search for a tool that could actually fit the human hand. Enter the era of the plastic revolution, led by a clinical, utilitarian newcomer from Austria that would eventually strip the glamour away from the Hollywood gun. When the Glock 17 arrived on American shores, it didn't look like a movie star. It looked like a kitchen appliance, devoid of chrome, wood, or soul. But the Glock offered something the Beretta and the Smith & Wesson could not, a consistent, lightweight polymer frame that shaved half a pound off the officer's waistline. In the world of professional policing, where you carry your weapon for 4,000 hours a year and fire it for perhaps 40 minutes, weight is more important than aesthetics. The shift to polymer-framed strikers like the Glock and later the Sig Sauer P320 marked the end of the hero gun archetype in real-world holsters. These weapons lacked the external hammers and manual safeties that provided such great clicking sound effects in action movies, opting instead for a cold, efficient, point-and-shoot philosophy. Reliability in the streets is a different beast than reliability on a movie set, where a prop master cleans the weapon after every take. A real duty weapon lives in a world of rain, spilled coffee, lint, and sweat, often going weeks without a proper cleaning, while still being expected to function perfectly. The Beretta 92FS, while legendary, had a complex slide-mounted safety that many officers found difficult to manipulate under the adrenaline dump of a real gunfight. In the heat of a life-or-death encounter, fine motor skills evaporate, and the simplicity of a Glock or a Sig becomes a literal lifesaver. Furthermore, the stopping power myth of the .44 Magnum was replaced by the pragmatic science of modern ballistics and the 9mm Parabellum. Law enforcement agencies realized that 3 accurate hits from a 9mm were infinitely more effective than 1 miss from a thunderous .357 or .44. The modern officer's burden is also one of accountability, a factor Hollywood rarely explores behind the curtain of a high-speed chase. Every round fired must be accounted for, and the massive over-penetration of a dirty, hairy Magnum poses a lethal risk to bystanders 3 walls away. Today, if you look at the holsters of the LAPD or the NYPD, you won't find the polished steel of a cinematic icon. You will find the matte black finish of a Sig Sauer, a Glock, or a Smith & Wesson M&P, tools designed by engineers and bean counters, not by stylists and cinematographers. These modern duty pistols are ergonomic marvels, featuring interchangeable backstraps to fit any hand size, and integrated rails for tactical lights.
They are superior in every functional metric: capacity, weight, reliability, and ease of use, yet they remain boring to the camera's eye. The irony of the Hollywood cop gun is that the more effective a weapon becomes in the real world, the less interesting it becomes on the silver screen. A Glock doesn't have the dramatic silhouette of a long-barreled revolver, and it doesn't catch the light with the same predatory grace as a Beretta's open-top slide. The officer on the street doesn't care about the cool factor, or how the weapon looks in a leather holster during the close-up. They care about the fact that their lower back doesn't ache at the end of the week, and that the trigger pull is exactly the same every single time they press it. We have moved away from the era of the gun as a character, and into the era of the gun as a peripheral. The weapon has become an extension of the uniform, as standardized and unremarkable as a radio or a pair of handcuffs. This transition reflects a broader shift in policing itself, moving away from the cowboy mythology of the 1970s toward a more professionalized, albeit less cinematic reality. The chrome is gone, the wood grips have been replaced by stippled plastic, and the thunderous roar has been traded for a controlled, repeatable pop. The Hollywood gun lives on in our collective imagination, a relic of a time when we wanted our heroes to carry cannons. But for those who actually walk the thin blue line, the reality is a lightweight, black plastic tool that will likely never be fired outside of a training range. And that is exactly how they prefer it. Part 6. The Legacy of the Chrome Barrel. The cinematic smoke has cleared, but the silhouette remains etched into the bedrock of global culture. We find ourselves at a strange crossroads, where the line between a functional tool and a cultural icon has completely blurred. The Hollywood cop gun is no longer just a weapon. It is a visual shorthand for authority, rebellion, and the American mythos. Walk into any gun store from Texas to Thailand, and you will see the ripple effect of 1970s and 80s cinema. The Smith Wesson Model 29 should have been a niche tool for handgun hunters and enthusiasts of extreme ballistics. Instead, it became a mandatory collector's item because a fictional inspector named Harry Callahan dared to ask if a criminal felt lucky. This is the Dirty Harry effect, a phenomenon where sales of a specific firearm skyrocket, not because of a military contract, but because of a lighting setup and a well-delivered monologue. Smith & Wesson struggled to keep up with production for years, as civilians clamored for a .44 Magnum they could barely shoot straight. It was the first true instance of a movie star outshining the product itself, turning steel and wood into a symbol of uncompromising justice. The Beretta 92FS followed a different but equally influential trajectory, bridging the gap between the gritty realism of the street and the high-octane fantasy of the blockbuster. It represented the Wonder 9 revolution, a shift in the American psyche from the rugged individualism of the six-shooter to the tactical efficiency of the high-capacity semi-auto. When John McClane crawled through those vents in Nakatomi Plaza, he wasn't just carrying a pistol, he was carrying the future of law enforcement aesthetics. The irony is thick enough to stop a bullet. The very features that made these guns cinematic are often the reasons they were phased out of actual duty holsters. The thunderous muzzle flash of the Model 29 looks magnificent on 35mm film, illuminating the hero's face in a dramatic burst of orange light. In a real-world dark alley, that same flash would blind the officer, leaving them vulnerable and disoriented. The weight of a full-sized Beretta 92FS provides a satisfying clink when dropped onto a table in a dramatic interrogation scene. But for a patrol officer working the 12-hour shift,
That weight is a constant strain on the lower back and hips. Reality moved toward the utilitarian, plastic fantastic of the Glock, while the legends stayed behind to bask in the glow of the silver screen. Yet we cannot dismiss the power of the image, for the image eventually dictated the reality of the market. The massive success of these firearms in film forced manufacturers to prioritize aesthetics and screen presence in their marketing. We began to see tactical and special edition finishes that served no functional purpose other than to look formidable in a holster or a display case. The chrome barrel and the polished slide became the armor of the modern knight, a visual promise of power that resonated with audiences worldwide.
Even today, when a director wants to signal that a character is old school or dangerous, they reach for the heavy iron of a revolver. The weapon tells the story before the actor even speaks a word of dialogue, serving as a character in its own right. There is a profound nostalgia in the way we view these Hollywood guns, a longing for an era where the stakes felt higher and the heroes felt larger than life. We know intellectually that a polymer-framed 9mm is a superior tool for the job in every measurable metric. But the heart doesn't beat faster for a piece of injection-molded plastic. It beats for the cold, heavy steel of a masterpiece. The legacy of the chrome barrel is found in the way it shaped the public's perception of what a hero looks like. It created a standard of coolness that real-world agencies sometimes struggle to live up to, leading to a disconnect between the public's expectations and the mundane reality of police work. We wanted our officers to be titans with cannons. All the officers just wanted to go home safely at the end of the night. As we look back at the history of these iconic firearms, we see a feedback loop between fiction and friction. The movie sold the dream of the unstoppable handgun, and the public bought into that dream with every ticket and every purchase at the gun counter. It is a testament to the power of storytelling that a mechanical device can become a vessel for our collective ideals of bravery and strength. The Hollywood cop gun stereotype is both a lie and a profound truth. It is a lie in its technical portrayal, the infinite ammo, the lack of recoil, the magical stopping power. But it is a truth in its cultural impact, having defined the visual language of the 20th century more effectively than any history book ever could. The Beretta 92 FS and the S&W Model 29 are the twin pillars of this temple of steel, representing the transition from the old world to the new. They remind us that while technology marches forward toward efficiency and lightness, our imagination will always be tethered to the heavy, the loud, and the dramatic. We don't want our movies to be realistic. We want them to be mythic. And these guns are the thunderbolts of those modern myths. So, the next time you see that unmistakable silhouette on screen, remember the engineering truth behind the cinematic fiction. Appreciate the weight of the steel, the complexity of the sear, and the raw physics that the director is choosing to ignore for the sake of the shot. The Hollywood gun isn't just a prop. It is the bridge between the world we live in and the world we wish to see, where justice is loud, the chrome is bright, and the hero never runs out of ammunition.